What is up with the Backrooms? Right now, we got this movie coming out, which I'm actually excited about. I think it's going to be a really good movie, and I am impressed with Kane and his skills. This trailer looks awesome, I have to say. And I mean, even watching Kane Parsons clips and videos, I was super impressed. I was like, this dude is skilled. And so I'll show you real quick. Something's wrong with the wall, right? He's doing a late night cleanup. He looks over there and there's a hole in the wall. And then he walks through it, and lo and behold, it's the back room. It's the liminal space, son. What's the liminal space? The liminal space evolved out of creepypastas and this idea on 4chan, Reddit, this kind of stuff, that there were spaces that you could no clip into. You could glitch out of reality into some alternate infinite hell world, a sort of labyrinth of the corporate nihilistic empty space between worlds or between realities. The liminal space is from the Latin word that has to do with threshold. So an in-between. I think also simultaneously with that kind of its own internet lore taking on a life of its own, you also had other films and popular books and things that popularized the liminal space, right? Stranger Things, or Stranger's Thing if you watched the last season. And that popularized the upside down, right? This other world, this other dimension, this other reality that is the negative space. It is a, perhaps a purgatorial sort of idea. There's a lot of parallels. It also resonates because of the emptiness of the corporate world, the cold, calculated corporate world and its nihilistic abandon, and the meaninglessness of a corporate lifestyle to attain corporate products that ultimately go out of style within 5 to 10 years anyway. So it's a sort of meaningless Ouroboros eating its own meaningless tail. And then the idea becomes, what if you entered that space of something like a stock footage video? What if you went into the world where stock footage was reality, but not stock footage of today, not a present day reality, but for some reason always connected to, always grasping back to the 80s and the 90s. For some reason, everyone felt that the lore of the Backrooms and the liminal space was necessarily connected to the 80s and 90s. Why is that? Here are my theories. This is my thoughts. It is resonating with people because we are at a threshold of generations where people like myself, on the cusp of Gen X and Millennial, I remember the world prior to internet everywhere. The generations under me do not know that world. And that world was still essentially primarily human. I mean, tech was obviously beginning to invade our life with VHS, CDs, DVDs, etc. MP3 began to be popular in the late 90s, early 2000s. But your day-to-day did not include significant amounts of internet at all, unless you had some lame-ass dial. And then you could wait 20 minutes for a low-resolution picture to load up, right? Otherwise, you didn't spend a whole lot of time on the internet until the early 2000s, right? So we are remembering, there is still in the collective unconscious this memory of a time when there was a human realm, even at work, the corporate work part of your life. There was still this human element to where you had a limited time there. You went to a physical location. You had your own office, you had your own desk, etc., right? Even when you started having cubicles, right? You still had your own space. You decorated it the way you wanted, etc. And even office space changed with the times to where you didn't have your own office. Everyone worked in an open space in the cubicles. And then the cubicles went away and you went to having open spaces. And then you have shared desks that you do, like at Verizon or whatever, right? So you've seen less and less individualism even within the workspace. It's all been homogenized and corporatized and made linear and made flat. And because the Backrooms are a labyrinth that has no resolution, that immediately expresses the nihilism of the modern corporate mindset and corporate world. But it's frozen in the 80s and the 90s because that was the period when there's the last remembrances of it being still human, right? So you have people's desks, people's property, their own expressions now completely erased. And in the back rooms, there's no people. So a human being is actually out of place in the corporate world or in this corporate dystopian hell dimension because it's anti-human. The corporate world had as its underlying engine and ethos an anti-human idea the entire time, because the logic of it was everything is quantified, everything is quantifiable. It's inherently nihilistic and anti-natalist and anti-human. So it must, of its own logic, eventually eliminate all of the human and all of the particular and all of the individual, to eventually just propagate itself as negating any of the commodities that it produced. And so the corporate space exists eventually to only perpetuate an anti-human, non-human corporate space with no objects or no products. Why? Because the ultimate goal of the monopoly attitude is actually to destroy all competition. And thus, the products that it sells, even after it's gotten rid of the humans, the products are no longer necessary. In other words, products were a means to an end. It was never about creating a better product. It was about creating the end of humanity. Thus, we look back on the threshold to a time when it was still human. We look back to the liminal spaces of the shopping mall, right? Perhaps shopping mall backrooms and liminal spaces are even more telling in this regard, right? I also have some theories too as to why this has become so popular online. I actually think the internet is itself the liminal space as well. I'll show you what I mean here with a couple of examples of this. Dead malls, right? The dead mall, as we like to call it, is an eerie corporate liminal space with its own aesthetic and vibe that now has no people and has no product and becomes this sort of ideological museum to a forgotten time and a forgotten way of being that we can remember, but also we can't remember, because when you look at it without any people, and the purpose of the shopping mall was to sell the products, right? So to see it without humans and without products, it almost seems like a dystopian hellscape where what if the purpose of all this and its purposelessness was actually to produce a kind of purposelessness in the humans themselves. Now, I'm not saying that every mall owner, and I'm not trying to make some Marxist socialist critique or something like that. That's not what I'm saying here. I'm not a Marxist or a socialist, but I'm saying when you have a materialist capitalist society, and the same goes for Sovietism too, because they're both materialist atheistic presuppositions. If you have a monopoly capitalistic society's presupposition about the attainment of meaningless corporate goods that also become meaningless within a few years because they're no longer trendy and they're not actually made to last, they're actually made to, through planned obsolescence, go away. It speaks to the emptiness of the cycle. I think Day of the Dead and Chopping Mall, although they're goofy B movies, they actually have some of these deeper philosophical themes in them. And we did a whole analysis of Chopping Mall. If you didn't ever watch that back in the old days, we actually hit on some of that back when we did Chopping Mall. Because if you don't remember, the villain in Chopping Mall is like a Robbie the Robot version. It's like a Terminator, but it's like a B movie version of Terminator. Anyway, I can't think of the name of our stream, but yes, we did do Chopping Mall. I'll have to find it later. But so the liminal space speaks to all of these realities, and some philosophers have called it, it's almost like, as some philosophers are calling it, a existential, it's industrial Gothic or corporate Gothic. So, go back to Gothic literature in the UK, and then in Victorian era, and then we have in the US Southern Gothic with people like Flannery O'Connor and whatnot, Cormac McCarthy as well. But with the liminal space, you have a modernized version of corporate industrial Gothic, where the great horror is the meaninglessness of what was so meaningful apparently at the time, right, in the 1980s and in the 1990s. And the mall ones are really interesting. And again, remember, Stranger Things also, I think, played a huge role in this, because what was it, season 3? The whole season was about the mall, right? The dead mall being this sort of portal to the in-between, to the hell world. And so it becomes its own aesthetic, its own vibe. And this is Kane's channel, who originally sort of popularized a lot of these. And his videos, his film school stuff was so good, and it became such a viral sensation over the last several years that they actually made him the director. So I think he's going to do well. I'm expecting it to be really cool. But if you go back to his older videos, and I think I've watched most of these when he was doing film school stuff, he did one here. This was the original Backrooms that's had like 80 million views, which is crazy. And it was a genius idea, right? To just kind of play around with looking into abandoned buildings or abandoned cargo stuff. And then you walk in and you find another reality, another dimension. And then people started getting more and more philosophical with it. And he was filming it with this sort of old school VHS look. But also people helped contribute to the lore, right? You had Reddit people, creepypasta people telling their own versions of the Backrooms. And then on top of that, you had TV shows that came out, probably also influenced by this, even though I know this was from a book. But Severance, everybody said, what about Severance? Severance. I've been meaning to get to Severance for so long, but the reason that I haven't got to it is because I think there's so many other things that it ties in with, like the Backrooms and the liminal space, that it makes sense to kind of talk about them all together. Because in Severance, the premise is that you have an intentional process that you can go through where they split your consciousness so that you are MPD DID, to have an innie and an outie. The innie being the person that is at the work world, and they have their own life in the work world, and they are split so that they don't know the life of the person outside of work. So it's actual like split, multiple personality disorder, but it's engineered by a mega corporation that does it to benefit supposedly the workers and to help production and all this kind of stuff. And I've seen season 1. I thought it was really good, and I'm about halfway through season 2. And it's interesting, but it also, I think, speaks to, even probably unknowingly, the elements of the actual MK Ultra projects and how they were studied and by how they were perfected by entities actually working for corporate structure, corporate interests. In other words, the Tavistock Institute, which was the first to really study MPD-DID through studying shell shock, and then got all this money put into it through the Rockefellers. They brought in Carl Jung, brought in all kinds of people over the years to study and perfect social engineering and human control. That's ultimately what Tavistock is about. And what began as World War I wartime psychological operations actually turned into an entire global institute connected to MK Ultra, intent on engineering the human mind to be obedient and to be involved in groupthink. So they really pioneered and mastered groupthink, and they did it they were contracted out by not just the CIA, not just the US government, the Pentagon, but the Fortune 100, Fortune 500. So, for example, when you see people like Peter Drucker, who comes up with the business church model of Ruslan, and all these other people, from Rick Warren to Ruslan, business church model is this. It is Tavistock social engineering groupthink models of how to streamline the business side of the church to make it more efficient. Taylorism, etc. All the above, right? But to get back to the Backrooms and to Severance, which, because I haven't finished season 2. I don't exactly know where Severance is going to go, but it is also consciously alluding to the corporate MK Ultra elements within the show. And in the course that you can imagine in the story, it's a question of, well, do we really want to be divided against ourselves? Which is probably a kind of a Marxist line of argumentation, because Marx's whole theory of alienation includes the idea that you're divided against yourself and against your product and against nature through the corporate world. I'm not a Marxist, but I do think at times Karl Marx said some things that were correct. And I do think that at times, if you commodify everything, that would be the natural result, right? You would have man divided not just against other men, but also alienated from the work that he produces from his hands and also from nature. Thus, you'll notice in the Backrooms, the hellscape, the hell world of the Backrooms, there's never anything typically nature related. There might here or there be a plastic palm tree or a plastic tree, but usually there's not. Usually there's just variations on the corporate scape and the corporate hellscape, or the patterned versions of the way that they do hotels now, which are becoming more and more, if you haven't noticed, like hospitals. And the same with, and I know this because we've traveled a whole lot in the last 5 years and we've stayed everywhere coast to coast countless times. Hotels they don't have any flavor to them, right? The corporate ones. They all become a kind of representation of the exact same thing that you get in a hotel, in a hospital, and in a hospice, in an old folks home, and then also perhaps in a bank. And that's why you guys, we've all noticed this with McDonald's too, right? Suddenly all of the corporate businesses out there are gray. McDonald's is gray. Tons of fast food restaurants, they all have the same gray look. We went by a Barnes and Noble the other, bookstores. It looked no different than a McDonald's with corporate Soviet gray. Isn't that interesting that what was Soviet brutalist architecture, supposedly the opposite of capitalism, right? The opposite of capitalism. Let's look up Soviet brutalist architecture. And it's like all giant concrete, it looks like nuclear concrete, bomb refuge type stuff. Like Chernobyl is no different than the freaking hotel, right? Like what was supposed to be a, Chernobyl structure is basically the same thing as the hotel. Soviet brutalism in terms of architecture, right? Everything is gray. Everything is ugly. And there's a reason for that, because it expresses the philosophy of everything being streamlined and homogenized, because anything that's not streamlined for efficiency is purposeless. So to have decor, to have, neoclassical Baroque styles, that would be a waste of money. It's inefficient. So you notice that corporate megastructure, monopoly capitalism's ethos is exactly the same as the Soviet brutalist ethos. Isn't that fascinating? It's brutalist, it's dystopian. A giant concrete block where you get your soy slop. Just hideous, colorless, worthless looking slop out of a giant concrete block. You see that this end goal of the corporate sphere is indistinguishable from the Soviet brutalist atheists, because they're all nihilistic. They're all atheistic in their vibe, in their ethos. And the Backrooms are basically expressing the same type of critique. Also, I think that if you remember Vaporwave, right? Synthwave, as Synthwave became popular, 10, 15 years ago, Synthwave is expressing an innate dystopian idea within it, because a lot of the art, a lot of the vibe of the synthwave was dystopian. In the 1980s and 90s, there were hosts of dystopian films, so they kind of became attached. They're adjacent to the milieu, the ethos of the 1980s, of its zeitgeist. And then it's only natural that what develops out of synthwave as a kind of first phase critique of corporate nihilism would develop vaporwave, right? And vaporwave gave us a critique of mall music, right? Corporate, meaningless, overproduced muzak. If you don't know, because you're young or something, in the 1980s and 90s, when you go to the mall or when you're in an elevator, they would have these specific types of stations or boxes called muzak, M-U-Z-A-K, right? And it was the corporate way to have all of your favorite songs in a non-copyrighted way. So it was like elevator music, and you might hear Kenny G, but it's the muzak version of Kenny G. So it's not the actual song. It's a voiceless corporate version of an actual pop song. Now, muzak existed earlier in the 60s and 70s, but I'm saying by the 1980s, muzak was doing, I don't know, you would hear Go West, but it would be the muzak version of Go West, right? So, sounds for the supermarket, right? And so vaporwave was a layer of parodying all of this by turning it into a critique of itself, right? And probably everybody's heard of the Macintosh Plus, the biggest hit from this era of vaporwave critiquing this type of nihilistic, meaningless mall culture or corporate culture. And if you grew up in the 80s, you resonated with this very, very well, right? It hits you. Somehow there's something about it that makes sense because you're reminiscing and remembering a time when it was a very different world. So again, liminal space is hitting everybody so hard, not just because of nostalgia, but because we are on a threshold of moving into a world where the dystopia is actually rolling out. All of those 80s movies, all of those dystopian films and stories and novels and comic books, there was within the zeitgeist a prophetic sense that this is coming, that this will arrive. Now you could say maybe there was an actual prophetic gift that art usually has, oftentimes has, we've talked about that many times, or perhaps it was seeded propaganda in some of the blockbusters and productions. Who knows what the real total explanation was, but we are resonating with it, not just because of nostalgia, not just because of the past, but this is something that I've heard no one else say, and this is my thought. What if the controllers, the social engineers, the technocrats, what if they've realized that to really destroy the peoples and the people groups, to corral them into the tech Skynet dystopia, what if the best thing to destroy, obviously I'm saying this includes God, the existence of God, all that stuff, sure. And yeah, they want to destroy the nuclear family. Yeah, I get it. I know all that. But nobody has talked about, what about destroying the past? What about wiping out and destroying the idea of the past? To have the dystopia, to have it successful, you must also wipe away any rootedness or groundedness of the past. And I don't just mean, oh yeah, the global elites go into a city, a place, they bomb it in the Middle East, they wipe out the past, and they set up, the McDonald's dystopia. I know that, but what about on an individual level? On an individual level, say a person who goes TRANZ. What is part of that ideology? Part of that ideology is there was no past. You were not actually born a man or a woman. You didn't actually have the upbringing that you had. You can erase all of that and immediately create a new identity for the here and the now. So the presupposition of all of the dystopia has to be a Maoist idea of erasing all the past. And this is something that they got from the communists and the Maoists and the Marxists. You must destroy the past. It must all come down. All of the dystopian stories also do usually have some, we've hidden the past, right? Which is a version of destroying the past. But I'm just saying, whether it's the Backrooms and the idea that, Oh, you don't need books anymore. Just watch the YouTube videos. Oh, you don't need to watch YouTube videos. Just watch the shorts and the TikTok brain rot. What is all of that about? It's all about squeezing the time frame smaller and smaller so that there's no past. In other words, within a video, you're not even remembering what you saw 20 minutes earlier in the video. You're only remembering a 60-minute clip, and perhaps you even forgot what the 60-minute clip was saying, or 60-second clip, what it was saying in the first few seconds. So the squeezing of the time scale smaller and smaller is also concurrent with nobody has a past. The past is being squeezed into the right now, just the now. The entire tech world and all of this is built on immediacy, efficiency and immediacy. Why read a book when you could ask the AI to summarize it and give you a 1-sentence, a 5-sentence summary? Why do anything that isn't efficient? Why write a letter? You have an email. I'm not saying the tech itself is the problem. The problem is the more that everyone gets addicted to the ease and the immediacy, then the more that they begin to operate like an algorithm as human beings, refining everything down to what's efficient and what's not efficient. That, I think, is something that I've not heard anyone talk about in terms of, and I know it's Maoist. I'm not saying that there's not other people have talked about wiping away the past, but I'm saying it's not just wiping away the past from a culture or a person. It's wiping away the past for individuals, your own past, and there is no future. So we talk about, for example, God being an eternal present, right? There's no past or future with God. There's only the eternal now. This is like a synthetic tech version of God, giving you a God mind where you believe that you're like the deity that only lives in the immediate present. And they have studied the communist dictators and their strategies for wiping away the past in the physical world. But what if they're wiping away the past from everybody in the mental world and in their own family world? Because families, for example, they have a story. They have a past, they have a present, and a future goals that they have as a family. A nation has a past, a present, and future goals as a nation state. But if everyone lives online in the virtual, and the virtual denigrates the past and tries to erase it and wipe it away, and to make everyone only focused on the immediate through the dopamine addictions of the scrolling, then what happens is everyone has a false godlike status of only living in the present. And as the Backrooms story progressed, as Kane made his videos, he started bringing in these hooded sort of science dudes, right? Because that's exactly what would happen in today's world. If there was some portal to another world or something like this discovered, why immediately the science men would come to try to explain it. And they would do their tests and they would begin to investigate the, early layers of the Backrooms and where they go, which is to say they go nowhere. They lead to loops of meaninglessness. In fact, the Backrooms, like a labyrinth or like the Theseus Minotaur story, they actually change. They're not logical. They are illogical. And they're more like prisons that trap you in a sort of nihilistic meaninglessness, perhaps expressing the way everyone feels that they're trapped in a nihilistic meaninglessness today. And he really kept building on the architecture of the original idea by people finding other doorways into the Backrooms. But you can never really get anywhere in the Backrooms. And just like in the story of Theseus in the labyrinth and the Minotaur, right? At the heart of the labyrinth is a monster, and you can never really defeat the monster, right? I don't know what the monster might be, and I mean, people have posited different ideas, like it's the corporate monopoly capital system itself that is the monster. Thus, all of reality itself, via the videos, is thus the upper layer of an infinite turtles all the way down of a fake reality. What does this mean? In my view, because the backrooms are really also kind of fake. In other words, there's nothing actually in them that's useful or substantial or meaningful. It's all just like worthless corporate desks, furniture, etc. Then perhaps reality itself in the postmodern corporate world is itself a meaningless virtual reality. Thus, it speaks to all the people who think that we live in a simulation, right? They buy into this very easily. What if reality itself is meaningless, right? That's ultimately what this means. And if you have this worldview, then reality is meaningless, right? Because you're in this corporate viper system that makes you work for it your whole life, and then you die. And so you're essentially like the office furniture. You're just another piece of the office furniture that gets replaced once you're no longer useful to human resources. And even human resources itself is a denigrating, dehumanizing title, because you're not actually a person. You are a battery, a resource, a limited resource, or perhaps not limited, because you can easily just be replaced. And thus the logic of the corporate world is just simply to reproduce the meaningless corporate world. That is it. But included within that is getting rid of the humans, right? And thus people see, then what if all of reality is really just this world, this hellscape? And that, I think, is what is the power of the film, I suspect, and the art films and the project here, right? Is that this is speaking to everyone in some deep archetypal level, and in some deep archetypal way, that all of modernity, because it's all premised on this ideology, something is wrong. It's off. It's all upside down. And of course, many of the elements of and layers and levels are upside down within the backrooms. So much like an MC Escher painting, you're stuck in a strange loop. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about philosophy of perception right here. And for those that don't know, a strange loop is this idea from one of these sort of genius type characters, Douglas Hofstadter. He wrote Gödel, Escher, Bach. You guys know we've talked about the loops that Gödel talked about in terms of set theory. And Hofstadter got the Nobel Prize for writing that book because he noticed patterns with the way that sets work, the way that music works, particularly certain Bach and Beethoven symphonies, the way they're written, and also with MC Escher's art, with the dimensionality that exists within his art, because it's 2D, but it shows all these 3D images, right? And sometimes, especially within the labyrinth paintings, you find these infinite loops. And so he formulated this connection between language, perception, set theory, music, all of these different domains, and how there is this repeated pattern of the loop. And nobody else has noticed the backrooms also being the same type of a strange loop. Now, just a little side note. This is relevant to what we argue when we talk about the transcendental argument, right? And the transcendental argument for God is specifically a theological type of argument, but the transcendental argument history also relates to all kinds of other things, right? You could do a transcendental argument for the self, right? In other words, how do I know that there's a self? Well, there must be some perceiver to have knowledge, right? Having knowledge presupposes a knower, and so Kant argued that to make a knowledge claim at all is a presuppositional type of argument for a transcendental unity of apperception concept. And all that's just fancy terminology for the self, that there is some sort of conscious self that is the haver of the experiences, or a haver of the knowledge, right? So in other words, referring to the self presupposes the self because there's a self having the experience of self, right? So there's this strange loop here, and this is why I've always argued that Gödel's incompleteness theorem is a kind of loose adjacent type of thing to a transcendental argument. You'll see how this relates back to Backrooms, this world where you enter and you can't really get out of it. It's almost like an internal psychological structure where you're stuck inside a loop, versus the exterior world, which makes sense and is rational. This is also the question of consciousness, right? There's something beyond just the physical material, substrate that holds, the body together, the atoms and the bones and all that, the molecules. There's something else beyond that is the I that's having the experiences. All right, now let's move up to the connection to the Escher part, because that's where it gets really fascinating in terms of the loops within, say, the labyrinths that Escher would draw. By the way, which refutes materialism, because you couldn't do these abstractions if everything were just base matter. Well, in regard to the incompleteness theorems, basically this was a dispute with Bertrand Russell that focused on the question of whether or not, as Russell thought, mathematics could be a complete explanation of all reality. And Gödel's response was, I can prove from mathematics itself that mathematics cannot explain all reality. And he used set theory to say that you can never have a complete set, because a set would also at some point necessarily refer outside of itself. Thus, set theory refutes the reductionist idea of a completely logical explication of all reality. Thus, you could see why it relates to transcendental type of argument. So this gets into like free will and all that too. But I want to get back to the Backrooms, because that's really all that was relevant to the Backrooms in that discussion. We've talked about that for a good while. Now, with regard to Keynes' presentations, there's also these pitfalls in these areas where it can get worse for you, right? You can fall into places where you feel like you're back to normal reality, but you're actually just in another version of the hell world, right? And a lot of movies have done this too, right? This is kind of a recurring presentation where you come out, you think that you're back to your neighborhood, but you're actually just in like a worse, demonic version of your neighborhood. So really cool stuff. I do expect the Backrooms trailer or the Backrooms film to be really good. And it looks like people are going to explore it further. They're going to get lost. Probably what will happen, and usually, I mean, I don't know, maybe not, but usually in horror films, what's going on is that you're the cause of your own prison, and so you have to confront your own trauma to get out of the, horror of the Backrooms. But that's my thoughts on the liminal space and the Backrooms. Let me see my notes here to make sure I got to all the points I wanted to get to. To recap, it's erasing the past. There is no past, present, or future in the Backrooms. There's just wandering to an infinite bunch of meaninglessness. It's existential dread and corporate nihilism. Corporatism is innately, thus, in the presentation of the Backrooms, anti-human. The liminal space is typically hearkening back to the 80s and the 90s, which was the last of the pre-virtual, pre-internet era. So we are longing for the human realm. The liminal space is also very much like the internet in that the meaning can very quickly be replaced and forgotten. Nobody remembers the news stories online from 5 years ago, right? For example, search engines have recently been retooled to where you really can't find old archive stuff anymore. And that was all by design. That's a version of erasing the past so that you only live in the immediate. It's industrial Gothic or institutional Gothic. It's the updated version of Gothic horror. Even the idea of no clipping into the Backrooms shows the gamification of all reality. Reality is now seen like the virtual, like the real, like the internet world. So the simulacra has replaced the simulation, which is the point of Baudrillard's whole essays, right? Almost again, a kind of a prophetic warning, even in films like The Matrix. And The Matrix is ultimately sort of Gnostic. It's a neo-Gnostic presentation, but there's still some truths within the idea of The Matrix. Like, what if we live so much in the virtual that the real world actually just gets replaced and becomes the virtual as well? And there was a guy who made a video, I think he's an Orthodox guy, Seraphim Wirch. I forget his exact name. I had not seen his stuff before. I'd heard of him before, but I never really watched his videos. He did a good video on this the other day where he argued that the virtual world doesn't have to even be a thing that you always live in perpetually, like in some coon pod, because if you spend all of your time in the virtual world online, if you significant amounts of time, and it actually programs you to act more like an algorithm, then you're already almost a virtual person. And you will already reinterpret the external real world as a virtual world. You're going to treat it the same way as the internet world. So the internet world already is the simulacra replacing the simulation, or the fake world. So you might not even need simulation theory, because people are already going to read all of reality as like the simulation or like the virtual. We mentioned severance. We mentioned the in-between, the upside down. We mentioned vaporwave, synthwave. What if reality itself is breaking and bending? Are we seeing all reality as virtual? So it might not be like some sort of cosmic horror in the sense of, Cthulhu, or in the sense of like H.P. Lovecraft, where metaphysical reality itself begins to break down. Although who knows, maybe at the end of the world, metaphysics itself starts breaking. I don't know. But like, what if the bleeding and breaking of reality isn't the actual external world, but the way that everybody's internal world and their worldview, their paradigm gets reprogrammed and restructured through the symbiotic loop of the internet? What if that retooling of the inner world of people then basically just makes them interpret the external world in these mind-controlled, hellish ways? Do you see what I'm saying? So you don't have to actually change the world. Like, well, we're gonna, turn on CERN to make it like fuck up metaphysics and reality. Well, all you have to do is like retool and re-imprint the mind of the humans to misinterpret reality itself, and then you don't need a CERN machine that makes time go backwards or some crazy shit, right? You just need dummies to be reprogrammed to interpret reality wrongly. And that's much more hellish and possible than turning on CERN and making the past be erased, or make Donald Trump time travel, whatever bullshit people think about CERN. There was a novel about this, which I had not heard of, called House of Leaves. We mentioned the Theseus, Minotaur, Labyrinth story. We referenced that extensively in our lengthy analysis of The Shining. The Shining is another presentation of the Labyrinth and the Theseus story. Jack is the Minotaur, of course. That's all self-conscious. So that's all of my ideas on it. It's a threshold, but a threshold to where? A threshold to perhaps hell, bleeding into hell world, bleeding into our world. Perhaps a threshold of the actual dystopia rolling out, the one that was warned about in all of these 1980s and 90s fiction stories, now manifesting into reality out of the collective unconscious, right? Perhaps that's really what's going on with the Backrooms. But I want to know what you guys think.